Hello, my name is Christopher Schneberger, and I'd like to present to you the strange case of Dr. Addison and the Crosswell twins. One note, the first few images are not in stereo. They are archival images for historical context. We are looking at Dr. Charles Addison, a scientist and photographer from the turn of the last century who ran a portrait studio in Chicago. In 1907, he made portraits of Lydia and Regina Crosswell, twin sisters of a wealthy family from Chicago's North Shore. Sadly, Lydia died in January of 1908, though the circumstances were unclear. Addison was called to the Crosswell estate to make this memorial portrait of Lydia. Sometime later, Addison was visited by Arthur Crosswell, the twins' father, who wanted Addison to make a portrait of the family. Apparently, Regina was having visions of her deceased sister and claimed to still talk and play with her. Mr. Crosswell felt that a new image of the family would help quell these visions. However, when Addison developed the glass plate from his view camera, he found something striking. A figure of a young girl stood to the right, looking quite like Lydia Crosswell. Arthur Crosswell was not happy with this finding, and accused Addison of being a charlatan. However, this served only to intrigue Addison, who could not explain the image and sought to prove or disprove the phenomenon. He set about making a series of portraits of Regina Crosswell, with the help of the Crosswell's governess, and he made them using a new camera he acquired, as he noted in his diary.
I decided to use a new camera that photographs in stereo, thus allowing the viewer to see the image with the added dimension of depth. I surmise it shall be easy to render the notion of the spirit false this way, for it will certainly show no such depth or volume. He goes on to describe his first session with Regina at the studio. I began by making a portrait of Regina seated in a chair facing front. Then another on the sofa, where she insisted on sitting to one side. Next, I had Regina sit at my desk. She was very intrigued by the new typewriting machine and enjoyed striking the keys. She frequently looked over her shoulder, consulting her phantom sister. I tried reminding Regina that there was nobody there, but this was no use. So, I invited her to simply play as she usually would. It was a fun exercise, and I may have made several nice images, including one of Regina holding a dress from the studio wardrobe in front of the dressing mirror. That night in his laboratory, Addison developed his negatives, writing in his diary, I am astonished. In every exposure there appears the image of Lydia Crosswell. How can this be? The camera seems to be in perfect working order. I am most perplexed.
Another session followed at Addison's studio. He wrote,
In another pose, Regina held up a hand mirror, seemingly to Lydia. But then, Regina suddenly began to weep. Maybe with this release, Regina will cease having her visions. The question remains, will I?
That night in his darkroom, Addison found no such release, writing,
Once again, all the images bear the likeness of Lydia Crosswell. Through the stereoscope, I can look at Lydia Crosswell and through her at the same time.
The next step for Addison was to photograph Regina Crosswell at her family's estate in Evanston, Illinois. Addison describes this day.
Far from giving up the vision of her sister, Regina said that she and Lydia would show me all the places they liked to play. I followed Regina, who often led her invisible sister by the hand. Sometimes she was led by Lydia as well. Even though I could not see Lydia myself, I was becoming more convinced of her presence, and have even begun to compose my exposures to account for her. The garden is immense and beautiful, and includes a small pond where Regina stared at her reflection. Regina also seemed to follow Lydia to a spot in the garden of no obvious significance. But then she said to me, Lydia says this is where she was found. As the afternoon grew late, Regina led me to the dunes and beach behind the house. Regina wrote her sister's name in the sand. Addison's last session photographing Regina Crosswell took place in the cemetery where Lydia was buried. Here again from Addison's diary. Under pretense of a botanical lesson, the governess brought Regina to meet me at the cemetery where Lydia is buried. Surprisingly, it is a Bohemian cemetery. Clearly the Crosswells are of English descent, so I am most curious why they would entomb their daughter there. I did make some exposures which hold promise. Some of these took place at the grave. Lydia's is of rough stone, and affixed upon it was a portrait of Lydia which I had made, now fashioned into a porcelain oval. Still, a man of Arthur Crosswell's means could afford a grander monument to his daughter. And why a Bohemian cemetery? In his diary, Dr. Addison began to wonder about the death of Lydia Crosswell, and had suspicions about several members of the Crosswell family, and Arthur Crosswell in particular. Addison also tried to present his research to the American Society for Photography, but was rejected. His final diary entry in June of 1908 records one last apparent finding. I have made an extraordinary discovery. Last night, while closely examining the Crosswell family portrait, I realized something quite astonishing. It could prove to be the solution to Lydia's murder. I am setting out tomorrow morning to see if my suspicion is correct. Unfortunately, Charles Addison disappeared and was never heard from again. In January of 2005, I created an exhibition at Flat File Gallery in Chicago about Dr. Addison. Here we see the front wall with text explaining the story along with many archival images. The inside of the exhibition space was a recreation of Dr. Addison's studio, as it may have looked in 1908, based on the photographs that have been uncovered. All of the images that remain of the Crosswell twins were displayed in the studio, along with several means for viewing the stereo photographs. Also, many of the original pieces of furniture were found and placed in the studio to recreate the arrangement found in the images. Thank you.